Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Christy Stanlake's Native American drama, A Critical Perspective. So if you are interested in Native American, First Nations Canadian, Inuit, Métis theater, anything like that, this is a really good starting place to get a sense of the kinds of things that make Indigenous North American drama so distinct. And I'm gonna call it Indigenous North American drama, but actually there are some broader connections in what Stanlake talks about here with, say, Aboriginal Australian drama, Maori drama out of New Zealand, these kinds of traditions, these other sort of indigenous types of drama under settler colonial nations. So, according to Stanlake, and I don't have a great sense of sort of the timeline of this, but I take her at her word on this. This is sort of the earliest scholarly monograph focused on Indigenous North American drama specifically. There had been a number of anthologies of Native American drama, First Nations Canadian drama, etc., etc. But this is the first, and there had been individual articles, chapters, bits and pieces. People talked about Indigenous North American drama within larger books about Indigenous arts, and on occasion larger books about sort of theater history, theater culture, etc., etc. But this is the first devoted one. So that's one of the things that makes it a good starting point if this is a field that you're interested in. It's also a pretty reasonably followable argument structure. Basically, if we sort of simplify Stanlake's argument, she identifies four major components or thematic elements that mark Native American, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis drama as distinctive. Those are placiality, which is basically the emphasis on place as an important defining element of a cultural experience or foundation of a worldview. The second and third, she really groups together and treats in one section. So that's storying, the importance of storytelling as a cultural mechanism for not only remembering the past, teaching moral lessons in the present, but also calling into existence a more desirable future. So, beyond just teaching, right? Because all stories have a potential for, they have a pedagogical potential, right? A potential to teach. Indigenous North American cultures, in many cases, emphasize that stories actually have a creative, constructive power. The other one that she treats along the same lines is tribalography. And the specific sort of definition of tribalography, I had a little bit of a difficult time. I'll say this. distinguishing the exact sort of delineation between triballography and storying. They seem to be very similar, as far as I can tell. And that may just be me sort of not... The fact that I was focused on storying, because that's more relevant to the research that I'm doing. But this, again, I think has to do with the specific ways in which an individual tribe or nation or group of Native Americans, First Nations, Canadians, whatever it is, utilize storying within their own distinctive culture. And that's actually really, really important because, while it's called Native American drama, is a very problematic tendency to sort of combine all Indigenous North Americans under one heading, because you have vastly different cultures. And obviously some cultures in certain, say, regions of North America are going to share major similarities. The Haudenosaunee and Algonquin, for instance, are both from the sort of New York, New England, Eastern Canada general region. They have a very similar environment that shaped these cultures, and so there are cultural similarities, etc., etc. But, like, the Inuit have a very different culture than the Pueblo, for instance. So, again, this is one of those things where, like, within different groups, they will have different things. And I think that's kind of what's connected to triballography, but I may be wrong about that. And then the fourth major component that Stanlake talks about is survivance. And this is a concept developed by Gerald Weisner, who's a really, really interesting thinker and artist in himself. But it has to do with the ways in which Indigenous peoples utilize stories, art, creativity, and similar ways of expressing identity in order to, on one level, sort of write back to colonial American, US, and Canadian societies, and sort of respond to this idea that, like, oh, that's an old civilization, right? The dead Indian trope, which is a thing that a lot of Indigenous theorists and artists confront. This idea that many people in the US and Canada have, that, like, oh, those cultures or that culture, again, a tendency to homogenize, that's extinct. That's done. That's no longer a viable civilization within the world. And of course, this isn't true. And this is one of the things that's central to the notion of survivance, is sort of writing back to this cultural erasure. But more importantly, in this concept of survivance is the self-awareness, the self-presentation of the ability of Indigenous peoples, both as a sort of collective and as individuals, to survive, to beat the colonial system in a way, right? That the centuries of persecution, of genocide, of cultural erasure, of dispossession, of cultural imperialism, enforced Christianity, enforced gender roles, enforced all these things, that these have not, in fact, erased indigenous people from North America or from the world, and they have not, in fact, erased North American indigenous people's traditions, customs, values, worldviews, etc., etc. And that is, from the perspective of someone like Weisner, and I think from the perspective of someone like Stanlake as well, it is more important in terms of survivance as a discipline, technique, whatever it is, that indigenous people affirm that survival to themselves, right? That indigenous arts, indigenous Native American theater, Native American drama speaks first and foremost to indigenous people to say, we are here. We have not gone anywhere, as much as the settler, colonial, and capitalist societies of the United States and Canada have attempted to erase us. So Stanlake takes those four perspectives, and she reads significant pieces of Native American and First Nations drama through these things to illustrate how these things show up in those dramatic traditions. Another thing that Stanlake talks about that I thought was really, really interesting and really important is that Indigenous North American drama is both similar to and different from post-colonial drama. And it's also similar. Indigenous drama is similar to and different from other indigenous art forms as well. So these are two sort of distinctions, comparison and contrasts that Stanlake makes. So it's similar to other indigenous art forms in that they tend to share similar ideas, right? These four components that Stanlake is looking at, they show up across indigenous art forms often. But because theater is a lived, embodied medium as opposed to things like fiction, poetry, painting, even film and television, for theater there is a much more direct, interpersonal, lived connection. And then Indigenous drama for Stanlake is similar to post-colonial drama in that colonialism, colonial violence, cultural imperialism, etc., plays a major part in shaping the kinds of subject matter, the ways that these artists engage with the world, their position in the world, etc., etc. But the distinction, or one of the distinctions that Stanlake draws that I think is a really good one, is that post-colonialism orients the arts in terms of binaries, colonizer and colonized, settler and native, etc., etc. Pre-colonial, post-colonial, or pre-colonial, colonial, colonial, and post-colonial, although that's really more of a triad. The point stands, nonetheless, that, and this is actually one criticism of post-colonialism, and one of the reasons why many, say, artists, philosophers, theorists in Africa, in South America, in Southern Asia, etc., have moved away to a certain degree from post-colonial theory. Post-colonialism always orients the artist in terms of responding to the act of colonialism, as opposed to having the possibility or the potentiality of self-definition apart from that colonial experience. And that's a really important component of Indigenous North American drama, is about envisioning a world built by Indigenous people for Indigenous people, rather than simply responding to the conditions of colonialism.